Good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us. Today, our Executive Director, Chris Costa, is joined by Dr. Joshua A. Geltzer, Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy Homeland Security Advisor for the White House National Security Council here in D.C. Previously, Josh served as Special Assistant to the President and Special Advisor to the Homeland Security Advisor on Countering Domestic Violent Extremism. And in that role, he oversaw the development of the U.S. government's first ever national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. Before returning to government service, he was the founding executive director and visiting professor of law at Georgetown Law's Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection. Additionally, he was an International Security Program Fellow at New America and an executive editor at Just Security. From 2015 to 2017, Josh served as the Senior Director for Counterterrorism at the National Security Council, having served previously as Deputy Legal Advisor to the National Security Council and as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the U.S. Department of Justice. Previous to those roles, he served as a law clerk to Justice Stephen Breyer of the U.S. Supreme Court. So I got tired just reading the highlights of your resume, Josh. So I am incredibly impressed and excited to hear what you have to say with all of that under your belt. Now, as you know, if you've been with us before, Chris and Josh are going to discuss the issues that are catching their attention. Then we'll turn to you for your questions. Please use the Q&A feature to write them in. We will try to get to as many of them as we can, but you know that can be difficult. So I apologize if I don't get to your question in advance. So now over to you, Chris Costa. Take it away.
Amanda, as always, thank you for the tremendous introduction. What a privilege it is to have Josh Geltzer from the White House taking some time from his busy schedule, running through some of the issues that he's tracking, to include very, very relevant issues related to domestic terrorism and some of the articles that I'm going to talk about that I've been tracking for the last couple of weeks. So I'd like to dive in and jump right into some of the articles that I think are very germane to national security. And the first issue is an article, Wall Street Journal and many other media outlets covered the fact that President Biden at Howard University was quoted as saying white supremacy is the most dangerous terrorist threat to the United States right now. That got my attention. He made reference to Charlottesville, and I'm hoping to hear from Josh kind of how we view the domestic terrorism threat currently. And that relates to some of the other stories we're also going to talk about, but I'd like to transition to both a counterintelligence as well as an intelligence collection threat coming out of Russia. So this past week, the United States shared that we have hacked and disabled a complex Russian cyber espionage operation that lasted for 20 years. And it seems that through a high-tech operation, the United States turned Russian malware against itself. In other words, from a counterintelligence standpoint, the United States for 20 years was able to monitor a Russian intelligence collection operation and then use malware to neutralize it. And by definition, that is exactly what a counterintelligence operation is supposed to do. The next article I'm tracking will be very relevant to Josh because Josh has worked a lot on wrongful detainee issues and hostage issues. And specifically, the United States recently announced that they're imposing sanctions on the Russian intelligence services That means the FSB, because the FSB is certainly involved with wrongful detention of U.S. citizens. Citizens like who? Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter. Josh may talk about him, but at the same time, the United States also designated some sanctions against specific named Iranian intelligence officers that are involved with Iranians wrongfully detaining Americans. So we have had a running dialogue for some time about wrongful detainees. The United States continues to underscore its importance and use appropriate tools such as sanctioning intelligence officers from Iran. And as I said, the FSB, the successor of the KGB, certainly an intelligence service that is very much knee-deep in wrongful detainees of Americans and cutting off access to their international financial networks and system. That's very important. Also related to Russia's intelligence service, and really an important story. So this isn't a classic espionage case, but as we talk about in the International Spy Museum, we often talk about propaganda. We have a gallery that tells stories of Russian propaganda as well as propaganda during World War II. Well, it seems that individuals in the United States, in Florida, in Missouri, I believe, a fringe political network, activists, if you will, have also been cooperating with Russian intelligence officers, as it turns out, to perpetuate Russian propaganda here in the United States. So the United States is very actively trying to counter that kind of work that is certainly inimical to U.S. interest. All right, now we're going to transition to the story of the day, and we kicked it off talking about President Biden's announcement at Howard University. We have some domestic terrorism related cases that have broken out in the media recently. And I should before that just this morning, my understanding is there is an elevated threat from racially or ethnically motivated terrorism. REMV is the term of art. In short, there is a heightened threat environment here in the United States. And that goes hand in glove with the story that I was tracking from last month that almost goes without explanation, that the increase of 350% in terms of domestic terrorism cases in the past 8 years is an alarming trend. We've talked about it at past spy chats. I think this is something that is very important. The source of that information is the Government Accountability Office, and that nests really with some of Josh's work that we talked about in his bio, putting together the nation's first domestic terrorism strategy in the first few months of the new administration. And that also dovetails with the cases that you've seen in the media. In Texas, of course, that was an anti-Semitic attack, as it turns out, where somebody certainly motivated by anti-Semitism attacked and killed several individuals at a mall in Texas. And it turns out that that part of that targeting was a result of the assailant, the perpetrator, being motivated by, again, anti-Semitism. The next story is an old story that happened in 2018. It's absolutely critical. It happened in Pittsburgh when, again, someone motivated by anti-Semitism killed 11 individuals and wounded 2 at a Pittsburgh synagogue. The Tree of Life in 2018. The trial just began, so that story is in the news. So you're starting to see a trend that links back to the president's announcement last weekend again at Howard University, not to mention the fact that the attack in Las Vegas in 2017, the lone shooter on October 1st, 2017, the sniper attack that made the news recently because it was suggested that although his final motivation is still undetermined, he apparently was angry at casinos. So it doesn't necessarily fit into some of the definitions of domestic terrorism, but that story also made the news, coupled with school shootings, et cetera. And the final story related to attacks here in the United States is just to wrap up the story that I've talked about since January, and that was the Manhattan bike bath terrorist, Sayfullah Saipov, who finally was sentenced to 10 life terms and 260 years in federal prison. So he'll go to jail for the rest of his life, but he avoided the death penalty. So that's an awful lot. I'm going to kick it over to my friend Josh to open up with his comments.
Chris, thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. It really is you are someone who's been an extraordinary colleague and friend in government and out of government, and someone who has done so much yourself and frankly as part of a family of patriotic service to this nation on the issues that you touched here today and many more. And it is a privilege always to get to see you and to talk about these sorts of issues with you, but even better when others are kind enough to join us, and I'm grateful for the chance today. There is a lot there, as you say, in that wonderful rundown you provided on stories, and I'll try to hit a few of them, and of course welcome the continuing conversation thereafter. Let's start with the issue of domestic terrorism and Charlottesville and interrelated issues, because that is not just something I care passionately about. It's something that I literally just came from part of our efforts to tackle. I walked up to have this conversation with you from the rollout, the announcement of the U.S. government's first ever national strategy for countering anti-Semitism. This is something the president has mentioned in a couple sets of remarks and statements, was in the works, and it is something that builds on the United We Stand Against Hate Summit that we convened here at the White House last year. All of this, in a sense, flows from the fact that hate-fueled violence fueled by a range of bigotries and ideologies and conspiracy theories in many cases, continues to act as not just a source of vitriol and bile, but as an actual motivator to violence in this country. That's a threat to public safety. It's a threat to Homeland Security. It's a threat to the very integrity of our democracy. And you've seen us take a number of steps to tackle that. There was the June 2021 release of this country's first ever national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. There was the summit I mentioned. And today is another landmark moment, because among the various appalling forms of hatred and bigotry swirling right now, it is anti-Semitism specifically that statistically accounts for the greatest number of that which gets categorized as hate crimes. And of course, hate crimes and domestic terrorism acts have a lot of overlap. They're not the same, but they often do overlap. And so even as we have worked hard to tackle the domestic terrorism, the hate crimes themselves, the president has been committed to rolling back the waves of fuel on that fire that get poured by too many people across this country. And so what you see today is a national strategy that sets out over 100 steps that federal departments and agencies can and will take in the next 12 months, in the next year, to get at this threat. Educational efforts, efforts to engage at the community level, efforts to ensure that enforcement, not just criminal law enforcement, but enforcement of our fair housing laws, our labor laws, are done with a sensitivity to this issue and what it can mean for democracies themselves when anti-Semitism is allowed to percolate and spread. That also relates to the what you referenced, the NTAS, National Terrorism Advisory System Bulletin, that was issued by the Department of Homeland Security in the past 24 hours or so, which reaffirms the heightened threat level that the NTAS bulletins have been indicating for a number of cycles now. And what that bulletin points out, and this is the transition here to the Saipov sentencing that you mentioned, Chris, is that even as we tackle a heightened state of domestic terrorist threats, the international terrorist threat has not gone away. It is still with us. It still poses a challenge, especially through lone actors or small groups who are radicalized here and then act on those ideologies. And we must tackle both as a government at the same time, the domestic terrorism threat and the international terrorist threat. The sentencing of Saipov is a reminder of how deadly that threat can be. And it is a reminder that the law enforcement tools, those who investigate and prosecute these acts, have the patience to see through justice, no matter how long it takes. We continue to work on both issue sets in a range of ways that perhaps we can tackle further in our conversation, Chris. But let me hit on a couple other things that you mentioned. So much there. One is the hostage and detainee issue set. And I appreciate your noting that it was just a couple weeks ago that our government, again, in a first ever step, announced sanctions against the FSB, a Russian actor, as well as a set of Iranian individuals and an actor for their role in wrongful detention of Americans. First time that foreign actors have ever been sanctioned under an authority that the president made possible through an executive order he issued last summer, but that built on a statutory change, the Levinson Act, which Congress passed in part thanks to the hard work of the Levinson family and others who've been such amazing advocates for this cause. We are very proud as an administration to build on the work that preceded us to bring home Americans held hostage and wrongfully detained abroad. We think we've seen some extraordinary successes in that area. Even as we resolve current cases, we are committed to preventing future ones. That's where those sanctions come in. We think that punishing actors, and by punishing, deterring actors, can be part of how we prevent the next generation of such cases from arising in the first place. But we also think more is required. That's why you've seen the State Department, through the leadership of Secretary Blinken and our Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, Roger Carstens, become advocates and full participants in a Canadian-led initiative to strengthen and affirm the global norms against treating Americans as political pawns, as bargaining chips alongside other nationals who are treated that way. And it's why you've seen the State Department clarify and make clearer to Americans where they run a risk of wrongful detention abroad by introducing last summer the D for wrongful detention indicator that now sits alongside travel advisories, countries where this risk is particularly high. So all of this, sanctions to deter and prevent, coalition to build global norms, clearer, crisper warnings to our own people, all of this we think can help prevent the next generation of cases, even as we work hard every day to resolve current cases, such as one you mentioned, Chris, the wrongful detention of Evan Gershkovich in Russia, as well as the continued wrongful detention of American Paul Whelan there, and of Americans wrongfully detained elsewhere in countries like Iran and Venezuela, as well as Americans held hostage. A lot more we could say on that very important issue set as the conversation continues. But one more thing. You mentioned our insight into Russian intelligence operations before, and it gives me a chance to talk about a critical intelligence collection authority, Section 702 of FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Because in general, we rely heavily on Section 702 for the collection of critical information against not just terrorist targets who've long been subject to 702 collection, but also to Chinese actors, to Russian actors, to threats against critical infrastructure here in the homeland, to cyber actors. Now, 702, without congressional action, is set to expire at the end of this year. And as the public has heard from us and from some on the Hill as well, for it to expire or even for it to be reauthorized in a way that didn't maintain its full efficacy would be an absolute setback. It would be tremendously detrimental to the national security interests of this country and to our efforts to understand what Russian actors, Chinese actors, other malicious actors are doing as they attempt to recruit sources, as they attempt to gain cyber access, as they attempt to contort, potentially use against us our critical infrastructure. This collection authority, which allows collection only against non-U.S. persons located abroad, is essential literally every day. We've talked in public remarks about how critical it is to over half of the articles that appear in the president's daily briefing material every single day. So your point about the insights we need to have against the actors who wish to do harm to Americans is a good prompt for emphasizing just how important it is that we and Congress work together to reauthorize in a way that maintains the full efficacy Section 702 of FISA. Chris, there is so much more we could say on some of those issues you put on the table, but I think I should probably pause now and let you and Amanda bring the conversation forward from here.
Thank you, Josh. That was very detailed and a lot of fidelity. I'm going to kick it over to Amanda, and we'll start taking questions because I saw many questions that were queued up. Thank you very much, Josh. I really appreciate you talking about 702 as well. We haven't talked about that a whole lot in past spy chats. That's very helpful. Go ahead, Amanda. I saw we have some great questions.
I think that we are going to get a lot of I think I'm going to have a lot of questions to deal with. So give me a moment as I get sorted. But this one came in early. Thank you. Which was, do social media platforms have a responsibility to combat domestic terrorism and extremism? And where do free speech protections end, or do they end? So your comments would be much appreciated.
It's a great and important question. And the short answer is we do think that private sector entities across the board have a responsibility to their own users, the American public, to ensure that what they make available is not exploited, contorted, misused for bad purposes, and indeed perhaps the worst purpose of all, which is moving people towards violence that can kill and maim others. You heard this today. For those who did have a chance to catch just before this, the rollout, the announcement of the National Strategy for Countering Anti-Semitism, you heard the Homeland Security Advisor, Liz Sherwood-Randall, directly address this point in her remarks, indicating that we think tech companies have a critical role to play as part of a whole of government and whole of society effort to deal with anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred and bigotry that can lead people to violence. Now, there's a second order question that's also important, which is, how do we as a government relate to those tech companies in tackling this challenge? And there, we do think it is critical to recognize the role of free speech, free association in this country, a role that we embrace, that we're proud of as a government, but frankly, I think all of us are as citizens. Where we think we can fit in is by educating and by informing. We do a lot as a government to try to educate a wide range of private sector actors about threats we see that they should be aware of and that they might want voluntarily to act against. This is not just the tech sector. We talk to cybersecurity firms and firms that rely on cybersecurity firms about cyber threats to their services, their platforms. We talk to those who operate critical infrastructure about a wide range of threats, not just cyber, which I just mentioned, but natural disasters that may be headed in the direction of their facilities. Similar to all of that, we do try to educate and inform tech sector participants, companies, platforms, social media companies, file upload sites, about where we see threats to them and to their users. And we continue to urge them to act on what we provide, as well as to act on what they themselves determine to be threats on their platform. So we think they have a critical role, and indeed I would say a responsibility to play in addressing what otherwise can be mobilization and radicalization to violence on these platforms.
Yeah, sorry, Amanda, I was just going to jump in and say I don't have that much to add. Josh and I have both worked these problems from a counterterrorism lens, and at the end of the day, that public-private partnership is absolutely a crucial component. And as the FBI director has said before, I believe I'm quoting him when I say he has said that the FBI is not the internet police, nor is some of the components at DHS, Department of Homeland Security at the same time. This idea of education and the idea of identifying when somebody moves beyond hateful speech protected by the First Amendment and moves into the activation or mobilization for violence. And that is quite a challenge, but it is everybody's responsibility.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions about the criminality, overstepping, when is something a protected constitutional right? When has it crossed the line? How is that recognized? How do you pursue insider threats when we are also trying to protect privacy?
That's precisely the issue of finding that balance.
And I would emphasize in the spirit of this that when we engage with the private sector in other ways, we do so in a manner that is non-coercive, that allows them to be informed and figure out what steps they want to take. And that means the information we provide to them is intended to be certainly calibrated and we think useful to them, but it also is informative, hopefully, to them to figure out what the appropriate next step might be. That which reaches the level of criminality, that often we as a government can handle. We alone have, in fact, the tools of law enforcement. But there's a lot short of criminality that, for example, the tech sector promises to its users it will help to patrol and curate for them, because it promises communities of users an experience that is safe, that is secure, that doesn't have individuals sharing graphic violence, for example, or that is leading people to the siren call of ISIS, perhaps, or domestic terrorists in another set of all too real examples. And so we do think there's a conversation that's important to have, first between government and a wide range of private sector actors about how we can help inform them about threats, and then for them to have, both individually and across their industries, about what it means to responsibly ensure that whatever domain of the private sector they operate, critical infrastructure, financial sector, or the tech sector with all the services that it provides in terms of social media and file upload sites, that they're doing so in a way that lives up not only to the wonderful services, wonderful uses of those services that can exist, but to some of the malicious ones as well.
Do you see incels, these isolated young people, are they being preyed upon by white supremacists or other groups trying to activate them, or are they just finding their way to extremist groups by themselves?
Let me say a word on this, and I want to turn to Chris, who's actually spent time interviewing people who've gone through the radicalization and in some ways the pathway back out of it. I bet he will have thoughts. But you're bringing up, Amanda, of the incel or involuntary celibate movement. It's a useful microcosm into talking about some of the ideologies leading people to violence today. Because first, for at least two reasons. One, that radicalization to violence is not the monopoly of any part of the political spectrum. Mm-hmm. There are those moved to violence on the left, on the right, and in the case of incels, off the political spectrum. I wouldn't know where to put them on the political spectrum if I were urged to, and I'm not sure anyone else could or would either. So it speaks to the fact that as we talk about domestic terrorism and threats to violence emanating from domestic ideologies, those can come across the political spectrum, and that's why we have a national strategy that is agnostic as to politics. It simply cares, are you trying to get violent with your worldview? Because that's where it's unacceptable and indeed generally criminal. That's one key point. The other point, which your question points to, is that these ideologies tend to be less stable over time, less crisply defined as even, for example, some other abhorrent ideologies, like the ones that have moved ISIS adherents or Al-Qaeda followers to violence for too many years now. And whether it is the ideologies that we tend to categorize as anti-government, whether they tend to be the domestic terrorism related ideologies we talk about as racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, or whether it's those who subscribe to the incel movement, there tends to be an evolution, there tends to be some overlap, and there tends to be a picking and choosing, a playing with these themes or notions and then putting them down and picking up some others that can occur across communities, often online, but not exclusively, and even over time for any one individual, as they toy with certain memes, certain notions, often conspiracy theories, and then integrate new elements and ditch old elements. That's very challenging for us to try to analyze, share understandings of with state and local law enforcement, as well as across the federal family, and counteract. But it's also a recognition of where we are in terms of some of that which moves people to violence. But Chris, I want you to comment on this because you've spent face-to-face time with individuals who've gone through a radicalization pathway.
Yeah, I have, Josh. Thank you very much for the opportunity. So I'll just weigh in on the point of incels being idiosyncratic. That's how I view them in terms of their ideological underpinnings. Certainly they're misogynist, meaning they go after women and they're angry about women. They don't normally target just women, but they're certainly misogynist in their ideological underpinning. But they're idiosyncratic in terms of their sort of not a psychological, I'm not using this as a psychological term, but they're almost schizophrenic in terms of their all over the map, right? So I'm using the term in the broadest sense, and it tracks with what Josh just referenced, and that's this idea that there are individuals now that have a grievance, and then they're in search of an ideology to satisfy that particular grievance. So the FBI director has talked about this. I have talked about it on past spy chats, this very notion that individuals are shopping for the right ideology that fits their anger. And if it happens to be women, then incels fit, but they're not ideologically pure. So the individuals, even that are playing around with the idea of swearing by an oath to ISIS, might also be interested in an organization that's not ideologically aligned to ISIS objectives. So that is a problematic trend that I'm seeing. Director Ray has talked about it, and we've had some of our other experts on Spy Chat refer to it, but it is a problematic trend. At least historically, we understood some of the rudiments of different ideologies, and we were able to see the flags and to track the radicalization process was more logical. Al-Awlaki, certainly some of what he did, the propagandist for Al-Qaeda, it was very consistent, and many of the jihadists listened to his views, embraced those views, and then systematically mobilized for violence. So it's something we need to continue to watch. Is that fair, Josh?
Very fair. And, it speaks to, I think, another challenging part of the threat landscape right now, which is the amorphous nature of the movements themselves. ISIS has a certain hierarchy to it among its global network and affiliates. Those who consider them part of it were, if not literally card carrying, though some of them were literally and remain literally card carrying at least metaphorically speaking. Al-Qaeda, similar, whereas especially the racially or ethnically motivated violent extremist movement, which is bigger than just our country. It is global. We've seen Europe face this. We've seen South America face this. It is not structured that same way. It tends to be more amorphous, often with individuals who think of themselves as aligned with some aspects of a movement and maybe other movements, as part of communities of interest online, which they dip into and dip out of. And so in addition to that individual, each individual having a more complicated sense of finding what I think Chris rightly called the ideology that fits that grievance, that fits the sense of grievance even, there's also at the group level, movement level, a less clear hierarchy, a less stable structure, and a more shifting and often amorphous way of arranging affiliations and allegiances.
This is not terrorist related, but it is adjacent to the conversation of people finding, their groups or their path, and that relates to the young Air National Guardsman who has been in the news through his release on Discord of classified material. But this question audience member wants to know, why did someone like him have access to classified material? And why? And is that a result of, the post 9/11 push to share information across the board? Or was this just somebody who was kind of doing secretarial stuff and people should have paid better attention to him?
I'll say just a word on this, and not too much because it is an ongoing law enforcement matter. Obviously, he is prosecuted by our colleagues in federal law enforcement. And then Chris, who has worked with sensitive material from many roles as a uniformed member of our military, civilian in the Defense Department, senior official here at the National Security Council. I bet he will have thoughts on this. But I will just say that those questions are ones that we are, of course, asking ourselves as an executive branch, because when something bad happens like this, we, of course, need to bring to justice those responsible for it, but we also need to figure out how to do better next time. And a number of us who've had the privilege of serving in government have seen past disclosures, harmful disclosures like this one of materials. And it is incumbent on us as a community to figure out what happened, what went wrong, and how we try to do better moving forward. And so I want the individual who asked that very good set of questions and then other viewers and listeners to know that those are the right questions for us to ask ourselves, and we'll figure out how to keep improving as we go forward. But Chris, in terms of touching this sort of sensitive material in various roles, I bet you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think this particular unit had a worldwide mission, so you can't ramp up on the intelligence when you have a crisis. So it's ongoing, it's iterative. We have people that see routine briefings. Now, it seems to me, and again, this is part of the investigation, there was way too much access to this particular individual, but his mission and role, it seems consistent with somebody that is in an organization that has a worldwide global mission and has to see intelligence, not just defined for one particular geographic area, but potentially other areas that his organization could be required to support. I want to go back to this idea of grievances and the very notion of radicalization, because what concerns me is this also is not a classic case of somebody that's spilling secrets, right? This is somebody that built a social network based on some kind of ego gratification, built his closed network online, became the old man inexplicably at 23 years old. It was like a father figure to younger individuals. And what he had in terms of currency was credibility, because he had access to secrets. This is through his view, not my view, right? And those access to secrets allowed people to listen to him. He had an audience. So this is deeply troubling. And it goes back to some of our discussions on counterintelligence with Alan Kohler before he retired. One of his last roles was to join us on Spy Chat and talk about some of the counterintelligence challenges. This is another example of a counterintelligence and a national security issue that we have to look at closely. Is this just the tip of the iceberg? How do we get at a radicalization process, or a process that turns somebody into a violator of espionage laws that normally would have access to intelligence, then does inexplicably what this individual did in Massachusetts, and that is take secrets and shares them and uses those secrets as a currency. It is really mind-boggling in many, many ways, but it's consistent with the trends that we've seen in radicalization. And that's really the point I wanted to make.
That is an intriguing through line, Chris. Thank you so much for that. One of our guests is mentioning a Texas State University research document, and it discusses naming terrorists in the media and how this can then enhance copycats. And if you are aware of this research, it reminds me of the not publicizing, mass murderers in the media. And is there a way to work with the media so that there's less attention around terrorists? Any thoughts on that, gentlemen?
I'm happy to start, and there's some parallel here to the conversation we were having about the tech sector, and that is, of course, not our role as government to dictate to a free press how they cover things, but we do have thoughts. Indeed, we think it's our responsibility to have thoughts in this area, given that the consequences can be copycats or others who are mobilized and motivated to violence. And I was working in this building when the horrific ISIS-inspired attack occurred at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. And I remember well, the mayor at the time had a deliberate focus in the days that followed. He focused on the community, and he focused on the victims, and he did not focus on the attacker. But that wasn't direction, so far as I know, that he got from here. That was just his impulse for how to take a community that was grieving and needed to be grieving, given the horror of what had just happened, 49 people killed, others injured, and focus on what would make them stronger as a community without indulging in the kind of focus on the attacker, or what led the attacker to do what he did, in a way that might inspire others who would not react the way most of us react to something like that, with horror, but instead with some sort of emulation or admiration. And I think to some extent, parts of the media followed his lead. And I think it was an admirable case study in how to grieve, how to emerge stronger as a community, and how to lead by example in putting the focus on those who suffered rather than those who caused that suffering. I know the media, at least many parts of it, continue to grapple with what it means to call attention to things that are obviously newsworthy, but in a way that doesn't essentially achieve the goals of terrorism, which is to spread fear outside, disproportionate to the amount of violence that any one attack is able to cause and inflict. Ultimately, that is what terrorists try to do. They try to have a far larger than direct impact, but an indirect impact by the coverage and by the fear that their attacks can generate. We try to resist that and indeed counteract that as a government in many ways, but we obviously welcome those outside government, including in the media, being thoughtful about how to thwart the very objectives of the attacks themselves.
Josh, that's a great lay down. And the bottom line is terrorism is ineluctably political for sure. And the media generally does not want to participate in those political dynamics and certainly doesn't want to support terrorist objectives. At the same time, it needs to be objective to the extent that they can. So this is a very divisive issue. If you read different news outlets, the way they characterize what some people would call terrorism is very different. Armed groups, terrorists, militants. So the media has to be very careful. So they have their own editorial guidelines for doing that. And in many cases, you'll note that they eschew the use of the term terrorism. Labeling is so critical to this discussion, and there is no right answer necessarily, other than terrorism is inherently political or it's religious in which is related. At the same time, there are impulses for communities that take it upon themselves to not name the assailants, for the same with the school shootings. So this is a divisive issue. It is not settled, to be sure, but I think as long as there's a concerted effort by the government and by the media to be responsible and not support violence that is political in nature, then I think that is exactly the right plane to be on.
Little detour from terrorism for a few moments, but I guess asking about global norms, and that it is often said, and China, Russia, Iran do not recognize the same global norms that perhaps the United States does. So how do we adjust globally the global norms? Just a teeny tiny question.
It's a great question. I'll use it as an excuse to go back to an issue that Chris brought up that is near and dear to his heart and mind, which is this issue of wrongful detentions of Americans and others, including by those very state actors you are describing, Amanda, or that the question it really is describing. And we did think it was important, really just the first weeks of this administration, as part of a more comprehensive effort to thwart, to stop the taking of American and other nationals as political tools, as bargaining chips by the regime in Caracas, the regime in Moscow, the regime in Tehran, to strengthen the global norm against it. Now, what does it mean to strengthen the global norm? Well, there's a Canadian-led initiative that essentially takes like-minded governments and has them sign up to the notion. Of course, we're not going to do this ourselves. We wouldn't. But beyond that, we will call out other governments when they do it. And naming and shaming is a piece of this, but so is working hard to try to prevent it, which can include greater awareness of the issue, greater warnings to our shared citizenry of these sorts of risks. There are other areas where we think building those sorts of global coalitions can be helpful. Of course, this was something essential and remains essential to countering ISIS. There was a really unprecedented global coalition that the US government helped to forge to counter ISIS and roll back what had been an extraordinary amount of territorial control in Syria and Iraq at one point. That coalition continues to work because ISIS continues and continues to work to degrade and ultimately defeat ISIS's transnational global network. We think there's a model there in the global coalition we are building to counter fentanyl and related substances, which are causing havoc in American communities and, frankly, other communities, including elsewhere in our own hemisphere, as well as in Europe and across the world at this point, because the cartels that try to ship and profit off, launder the profits back to themselves off the sale of these deadly drugs have become global in nature. And we have said publicly that even as we work extremely closely with our direct neighbors, Canada and Mexico, to tackle fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances before they can reach the sort of communities where they are causing far, far too many deaths, we are also building a global coalition against this threat. And we think those sorts of coalitions can establish sort of norms that make it harder, frankly, to be an outlier. And being candid, right now, the PRC, China is an outlier. The precursor chemicals that become the powder and ultimately the pills that kill Americans and others are coming out of China at simply unsustainable rates. You've seen us use tools to address that unilaterally: criminal charges, financial sanctions, the announcement of rewards for those who can bring to justice those responsible. But we think doing this multilaterally adds to the impact. So it's a couple areas where that sort of norm formation and augmentation we think can be helpful. Chris, I'm sure you'll have thoughts on all of this.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on the wrongful detainee issues. We always talk about hostages and wrongful detainees. And in many ways, I don't want to embarrass you, Josh, but you personify this idea of a public-private partnership, because the U.S. government does engage with nonprofits who do a range of work on hostage issues. And I think that's another really important point. Just like the FBI recognizes that they can't do counterintelligence without engaging with international businessmen, U.S. businessmen that operate internationally. So that public-private partnership, that is the new normal. That is the trajectory that we are on. And it works for hostages very, very nicely. The idea that there is a dialogue between nonprofits and the U.S. government, because our interests are the same: to bring justice to those hostages that are overseas and wrongful detainees. We want to bring them home to their respective families. So I think that's crucially important, along with this idea of other nations being aligned with the United States objectives, which are the right objectives for our respective citizenry. There's a lot we could talk about here, but I'll just stop there.
We don't want you to stop, Chris, but we'll let you stop. Great and interesting question from a guest that we love to hear from, who says that DHS seems to be working together with the CIA more and more regularly, and these cooperative efforts are quite effective for national security. But are there any thoughts on maintaining the firm line whereby CIA is not surveilling U.S. citizens, or other thoughts along that line?
Yeah, absolutely. There are parts of our intelligence community that have a foreign mandate, and it is critical to adhere to that. And there are parts of our intelligence community charged with the homeland protecting mission, and they themselves build in civil liberties and free speech, free association protections into that work, because it is so essential, especially when you're charged with protecting the homeland, to ensure that you're fostering in the homeland the sort of free exchange of ideas that we're all about protecting. That's what we're trying to ultimately secure when we're securing the homeland here. So it has been, I think, gratifying to me to see, since getting to return to government a little over 2 years ago, Department of Homeland Security, as well as FBI, which are really the homeland-oriented parts of the intelligence community, work to step up their game, so to speak, on homeland-originating threats, the sort of domestic terrorism, domestic violent extremist threats that Chris and I were discussing earlier, while at the same time not overstepping and building in the right sort of guardrails and safeguards. We need that effort to increase, and indeed, it's part of the first pillar of the national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, is increasing the frequency and the utility of the sort of information we share about these domestic origin, domestic focused threats. And we've checked up on how we're doing because we think a strategy is good, but implementation is even better. We have found that in the years since issuing that strategy, DHS and FBI have quantitatively increased their output. Indeed, each in a given year period have essentially doubled the output that they produce on these critical issues. But I think even more important than that, the feedback we get, especially from state, local, territorial, and tribal partners, critical law enforcement partners who are often on the front lines of detecting these sorts of threats, that feedback suggests that the utility of the information has gone up too. Domestic terrorism threats are often driven by lone actors or small groups, which means the sort of intelligence or information we have is not about long-running plots among many people beginning overseas and coming domestically, the sort of 9/11 paradigm, though it's critical to be prepared and to halt anything like that, of course. But as we tackle domestic terrorism threats, it's often more about helping state and local law enforcement with key dates of significance, key locations, key memes circulating online attempting to lead people to violence. Those are the sorts of things that I think DHS and FBI, working in a carefully calibrated way to ensure that they're not overstepping, to ensure they're respecting guardrails, are at the same time producing and sharing more fulsomely and more frequently with the federal family and with our partners in law enforcement at the state and local level to ensure that we are rising to the challenge of these domestic origin, domestic focus threats, but also being very conscious of the guardrails that apply in that context.
Yeah, and I would just underscore, that's well said, Josh. I would just underscore the idea, or foot stomp really, that it was the work that we did on counterterrorism as a result of 9/11 20 years ago that really fused this idea of a cooperation and kind of overcoming some of the barriers to cooperation and sharing. Yes, mistakes are going to be made. They're mostly procedural, and you'll read about mistakes made on 702 in the past. A lot of that is overblown, and the FBI in particular has put in mechanisms to ensure that some of those mistakes don't happen again, and they're mostly procedural or a lack of understanding on how some of the process and applications work. It's very, very technical, my understanding. The bottom line is the intentions are clear. There is a wall between, the CIA mission and DHS's mission, to be sure, domestic versus overseas. And I think the United States has figured out how to cooperate, collaborate, and to ensure that we don't overstretch, right?
So, Chris, I know that you were going to recommend a book earlier about Timothy McVeigh, and I'm not sure if you want to talk a little bit more about that. We were both, I know we discussed how troubled we were about the article in the New York Times about Timothy McVeigh, or not an article, an op-ed truly about his dreams coming true. I didn't know if you wanted to touch on that before we departed.
No, Amanda, thanks for the prompting, yeah, because around September 11th, the 20th anniversary, I wrote a piece on kind of my reflections on the trend from overseas terrorism, international terrorism, as it were, and kind of the evolution of domestic terrorism. And I talked about things like Ruby Ridge. I made reference to that. I made reference to Oklahoma City. And the bottom line is Jeff Toobin candidly just wrote a book about kind of the Timothy McVeigh reevaluated through the lens of January 6th, Ruby Ridge, and the third rail of conversation that no one talks a lot about, certainly in national security circles, and that is guns as a national security issue. So I will not tell the audience what my perspectives are on this particular book, other than to say I think it's worth reading and evaluate for yourself the impact of Oklahoma City and its relationship to where we are in terms of far-right extremism, in terms of far-right ideological underpinnings based on all of the themes that we talked about today. I think it's worth evaluating, and it couldn't have happened at a more interesting time as I think through all of the articles that we talked about and all that we heard from Josh today in terms of his work on the domestic front with respect to terrorism.
I apologize for what seems to be a technical glitch on our side, but I just wanted to build on what Chris said there for a moment, even if I'm now a disembodied voice. But it's so important to recognize that domestic terrorism is both old and new. It is new in some of the aspects, the particularities of these amorphous ideologies that are motivating people to violence. It is unfortunately new in the trend line, which has gone up in recent years in terms of attacks and especially lethalities, but it is also very old. And it is certainly old going back as far as Timothy McVeigh, but even older. And this was on our minds as we worked through developing the national strategy in the first half of 2021, because as we came close to its issuance in June, the president made a trip to talk about a horrific massacre that was a hate crimes, domestic terrorism, or set of acts of domestic terrorism that was the Tulsa massacre of 100 years earlier. And in his remarks in Tulsa, commemorating that just appalling set of acts of violence, the precise lethalities of which remain uncounted, he previewed that we'd be releasing a national strategy to counter domestic terrorism in coming weeks. And he called what happened in Tulsa domestic terrorism, in addition to being a set of hate crimes. And it struck us as we worked on it and as we reflected in the strategy itself as a reminder that it is true that there are new forms and new elements of domestic terrorism, but there are also very old ones, including communities in this country that have found domestic terrorism to be the foremost threat to them, foremost source of concern when it comes to politically motivated violence, long into the past. And so I think to have the sort of histories and books come out that remind us of these incidents in our past is important, not only because history needs to be preserved, but also as we grapple with the sort of threats we confront today.
I couldn't say it any better. I just want to also make the point that the idea that we have other anniversaries that really resonate in some of the far right universes, such as Waco. I mentioned Ruby Ridge, which was an arrest rate, that was linked to gun violations, and essentially it takes on themes of anti-government. And that's where I also want to emphasize, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll be super brief, the idea that you can bin much of what we talked about as an anti-government trend. And in fact, back in January, I've suggested that, as Josh just said explicitly, that far-right extremism, domestic terrorism has always been with us. And it's really been kind of an undertow along with the other threats that we face. All of that said, what I think is there's a wave of terrorism, a new generation that's forming and that's coalescing. And I'm starting to conclude, at least from a preliminary standpoint, that we're now in a far-right an anti-government universe. So again, you pick the ideology, but it's very much focused on anti-government, which is what Toobin argues in his book. So it does nest with some of the work that I've done. So for what it's worth, I really want our very intelligent audience to figure it out for themselves and make their own assessment. But Josh, thank you very much for joining us today. I really wanted you to have the last word, but I couldn't resist. Go ahead, over to you. There you are.
The last word will be to thank you, Chris, and to thank you, Amanda, and all those who tuned in. It's a privilege to get to be part of this conversation. It is a treat for all of us who live in DC to have the Spy Museum in town. And it's always a gift to get to spend time with you, Chris, and talk about issues that you have contributed mightily to in and out of government in the course of a distinguished career.
All right. I want to thank you both for being so knowledgeable and not terrorizing and terrifying me when you talk about such absolutely scary stuff. So you make it understandable and make me feel like there is a path forward. And I thank you both for that. This was really fascinating. And I have to tell you, our next program is going to be a virtual program at noon on May 31st with journalist Brett Forrest discussing his new book, Lost Son, with Dr. Andrew Hammond. So that will be an interesting noontime program. And if you'd like to sign up for that or other virtual or in-person things like the North Korean defector we're going to have speak live on June 8th, people, come sign up for that on our website calendar. And if you loved this program, we'd love to have your support. Please consider making a donation to the Spy Museum. Donors help us do programs. They help us take care of the collections. They help us do community outreach. So we really would appreciate that. And thank you, Chris. Thank you, Josh, so much.
Thank you so much, team, and thank you, Josh. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Chris and Amanda. I'm grateful.